ladies and gentlemen. I hope you've enjoyed the chance to stretch your legs, and it's time now to proceed with the more erudite part of the evening, and I'm delighted now to introduce our president for this year, Professor Douglas Gifford. We try to be kind to our presidents, asking only of them that they address the members of this club at this annual dinner. We could hardly have the pleasure of a more distinguished scholar in his knowledge of Walter Scott, since Professor Gifford is the Honorary Librarian of Scott's Library at Abbotsford and the Director of the Abbotsford Library Research Project Trust, a joint venture between the Advocates Library in Edinburgh and the University of Glasgow. The venture is undertaking a stock check of Scott's library, publishing unpublished material and undertaking further research into Scott's book collection. Douglas formerly held the Chair of Scottish Literature at the University of Glasgow, and he's written extensively on Scottish fiction, so we could hardly be more fortunate that he consented to be our president this year. So I'm delighted to ask Professor Douglas Gifford to propose the toast to the memory of Sir Walter Scott.
Ladies and gentlemen, Chairman, I am, of course, honoured to be doing this tonight. I'm going to talk about Scott's, not just about Scott, but Scott's legacy to Scotland and Scottish fiction. And my address proposes two things. First, that Scott's Scottish historical novels, despite their customary fortunate endings for their privileged fictitious protagonists, are in a sense, which I hope to explain shortly, defeated by history. And the second, that the influence of Scott's novels about a recurrently divided Scotland led to a neglected post-Scott school of Scottish fiction, a tradition which includes Stevenson, Neil Munro, S.R. Crockett, John Buchan, Violet Jacob, Naomi Mitchison, and many others. Forgive me if I begin with a brief and familiar overview of Scott's treatment of Scottish history. I remember realising when beginning to come to grips with the range of Scott's writing, there were unexpected and notable absences in the coverage of this historical fiction, as opposed to the broader treatment of Tales of a Grandfather. Might we not have expected Scott, as the celebrant of Scotland's history, to have been tempted by subjects such as, say, Columba, Kenneth MacAlpine, Macbeth, Malcolm Canmore, what too of Wallace, and Bruce, although Bruce is thrillingly treated in the all-too-neglected Lord of the Isles of 1815, one of the finest of the long poems. Likewise, there's no novel, as opposed to the tragedy of Flodden in Marmion, to develop the story of the cultural glory of the reign of James IV and its disastrous conclusion in 1513. So what then are Scott's period choices? From Scott's beginnings, as in The Way of the Last Minstrel, Scott's recurrent patterning is clear. From the divided allegiances of the poem's borders, conflict of Scots against Kerrs and Cessfords, to late fiction like The Two Drovers, where the opposition of national contrasts are presented in microcosm through the contrast of Robin Oig, passionate representative of a dying culture, and Harry Wakefield, representing English dominance and apparent civilization. Indeed, all his work, even when set in England or abroad, centres on situations in times of civil war and momentous cultural oppositions of the past against the present, disorder against order, emotion and often savage enthusiasm against prudence and reason, whether it's Normans and Saxons, Cavaliers against Roundheads, Crusaders against Saracens, Constantinople Christians against threatening heathens. In terms of Scotland, obviously, two great periods stand out. Clashes of disorder and order. On one hand, that of the 17th century in Scotland's religious divisions and the Covenanting Wars, and on the other, the 18th century Jacobite rebellions and the profound differences between older Highland society and culture and that of the Lowlands. And what are his great themes? In Scott's lifetime, Samuel Taylor Coleridge identified the heart of Scott's fiction as one of division. He said, "It is the contest between the two great moving principles of social humanity, religious adherence to the past and the ancient, the past and the ancient, the desire and the admiration of permanence on one hand, and on the other, the passion for increase of knowledge, for truth as the offspring of reason, in short, the mighty instinct of progression and free agency. Scott divided in his vision. Arguably, the most significant perceptions of Scott critics in the 20th century were to do with developing this theme, and how Scott was fascinated by the ways in which Scottish identity and Scott himself was trapped between political and cultural loyalties of the past and the present, as the point of change into what he saw as a necessary but prosaic and unloved future. We know that Scott's own loyalties were often severely strained. For example, from his acknowledgement that had he been alive at the time of the 45, his heart would have led him to join the prince, despite the prudence of his head. But it is not my purpose to review the well-known Scott contradictions between unionist lawyer and passionate lover of Scotland's history and culture. I have elsewhere argued that Scott, recognising Scotland's centuries of debilitating civil divisions and the post-Union erosion of Scottish cultural characteristics, sought in his fictions to create a story, what might almost be called a myth of Scottish regeneration. We know that he had ambitions, only partly fulfilled, to set forth in fiction the regions of Scotland to itself, from Shetland to the borders, illustrating periods of greatest change. I move now to the more contentious part of my address. Arguably, in portraying Scotland and the matter of Scotland, in helping his fellow Scots come to terms with history, Scott was bound to fail. Scotland's internecine history itself defeating his ambition. Or, to put it otherwise, Scott's Scottish fiction overall amounts to a tragic meta-novel, an overall novel, exploring what might superficially appear exotic, colourful and even romantic, but read perceptively, presenting a sad story of repeated disillusion and defeat. So often his most novel characters, from Flora MacIvor to Rob Roy, from Prince Charles to Red Gauntlet, are symbols of the failures of the past. And even when events seem to work out fortunately, we are reminded by Scott that, as in the case of Henry Morton's return to a Protestant Scotland in Old Mortality, that the Protestant settlement was not achieved by Morton, or indeed Scotland itself, but almost as a byproduct of the English decision to welcome William of Orange and the Glorious Revolution. For all Scott's noble attempt to write an affirmative and mythic Scottish novel, and the happy endings he allows the likes of Edward Waverley, Francis Baldiston and Henry Morton, and the host of what Scott called himself his insipid heroes, I contend that Scott's historical vision, divided between emotion and reason, like Scotland itself, was essentially bleak. This distinction between individual happiness on one level and historical tragedy on the other is important as a model for the novels of the heirs of Scott, whom I will discuss briefly. I argued that two contrasting aims underlie Scott's fiction. On the one hand, from the Lay of the Last Minstrel onwards, is a lawyer's movement towards reconciliation, of forgiveness for Scotland's troubles past. On the other, a poet's bleak regret that division and divided loyalties have been our Scottish inheritance. Scott wasn't alone in this underlying tragic vision of his country. The fiction of John Galt, especially in Ring and Gillies, his Covenanting novel, and The Entail in 1823, shares much of Scott's patterning of a past contrasted with a less than ideal present. James Hogg's Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner in 1824 even more strongly presents what becomes the central theme of our later historical fiction, that of the recurrent dilemma of the divided self in the divided family, divided community, set in a divided and often bigoted nation. And the role of their central protagonists in these major novels is to bear witness to the endless ways Scotland has destroyed itself. Scott died in 1832, Hogg in 1836, Galt in 1839. With their deaths, there followed a long period of anomie in Scottish literature. This is the period of Scots in Britain and Empire, influential to an extent hardly imaginable now, but also a half-century when Scottish culture was at its lowest ebb. With the disruption of 1843, ending the General Assembly's role as Scotland's forum for Scottish autonomy, with the ensuing domination of religious debate over culture, together with what David Dicey saw as the pernicious effects of Victorian gentility, and Blackwood's magazine now into its British and imperial heyday, Scottish literature was in eclipse. There were important writers: Carlyle, George MacDonald, Margaret Oliphant, James Thomson. All of these, all major writers though, just about, left Scotland, and as often as not, their work is set within an English rather than a Scottish context. Post-Ossian Celtic twilight became immensely popular, marginalising genuine Gaelic poetry, and there was the huge success of the Kildare movement in fiction. There was little significant fiction or poetry working seriously with the material of Scottish history and culture. And when Scottish literature revived in the 1880s with Stevenson, it was Scott's darker emphasis on irreconcilability and elegy, the note struck by the ending of Red Gauntlet, rather than his attempts to create narratives of Scottish regeneration. But there is one strong emphasis in Stevenson which links him outstandingly with Scott. You will recall, I'm sure, David Balfour's role in Kidnapped as witness to corruption and intrigue following the Appin murder of the Red Fox, and how he travels around Scotland witnessing its divisions between Highland and Lowland and the sophisticated and wily villainy of Edinburgh great ones. His adolescent naivety cannot alter the black course of history. Stevenson clearly felt this was an important statement, since, unusually for a writer of short stories and novels, often unfinished, he continued David's story so that Kidnapped and Katrina can be read as the ambitious novel David Balfour. Failing to save innocent James of the Glens from hanging, summing up his actions at the end of part 1 of Katrina before leaving for Holland, David expresses a new darkness in Scottish fiction. But I had had my view, says David, of that detestable business they call politics. I had seen it from behind when it is all bones and blackness, and I was cured for life. A plain, quiet path was that which I was ambitious to walk in, when I might keep my head out of the way of dangers and my conscience out of the road of temptation. For, upon a retrospect, it appeared that I had not done so grandly after all, but with the greatest possible amount of big speech and preparation had accomplished nothing. Think of the end of Rob Roy, think of the end of Waverley. All that has been risked by Edward Waverley is his neck. He has been rescued by others. Kidnapped, Katrina, The Master Ballantrae, Weir of Hermiston, re-established Scott's model of young men witnessing Scotland caught up in mighty events, despite themselves in mainly negative ways. They share Scott's use of polarised protagonists in David Balfour and Alan Breck, the brothers Ballantrae, and so many of his stories. I suggest that this pattern is more than inherited stereotype. Their various creators in these novels mean them to represent divided Scotland and its archetypes of division, in mind as well as allegiance. Here too are Scott's great themes: the failure of the past against a corrupt present, disorder against order, apparent romance undercut by more sordid reality, history's young protagonist trapped amidst ancient and pointless conflicts. All can be read as subsets of Coleridge's perception of Scott's grand central theme. Here too are versions of Scott's insipid heroes: David Balfour, Henry Ballantrae, young Archie Weir are the disillusioned descendants of Edward Waverley, sadder and wiser as Edward was by Ullswater, and have achieved nothing. Frank as Balderson, saved by a Highland outlaw. Even Henry Morton returning to Scotland as an outlaw in disguise. Stevenson passes on the type to Munro, Crockett, Buchan and others. They are even the central types in semi-historical novels, great novels such as The House with the Green Shutters of 1901 and Gillespie in 1914. I return to my argument, though, that Scott's fiction had two contending currents, that of reconciliation forgiveness. On one hand, an oblique recognition of fundamental Scottish irreconcilability on the other. And moving all too briefly now to discuss Scott's heirs, I begin with their adoption of his second and negative inheritance, the tradition of the divided self, the divided family and community in a nation riven by religion and politics. Neil Munro's historical fiction began with marvellous short stories in The Lost Pibroch of 1896, followed by the best of his many fine historical novels, John Splendid of 1898, Gillian the Dreamer of 1899, and The New Road in 1914. John Splendid is set in Inveraray at the time of Montrose's depredations and his stunning victory over Argyll at Inverlochy. Typically, as in the later novels, we have the Balfour-Breck contrasting pair locked in a bond of necessity. This time, the dour stay-at-home Colin Elrigmore contrasted with the dashing soldier of fortune, John Splendid MacIver, the Duke of Argyll's right-hand man. A mature reading of the novel reveals that Munro, like Scott, is revealing John Splendid's feat of clay and the Duke of Argyll's as part of the tragic weaknesses of Highland culture and unquestioning clan loyalties. Gillian the Dreamer, set in a decaying Inveraray after the Napoleonic Wars, likewise exposes the hollow braggadocio of the pensioned Highland officers, now anachronisms, with the talented boy Gillian, the dreamer and misfit, part of their dysfunctional family, the boy destroyed, like Archie Weir or young John Gooley of the House of the Green Shutters, by false authority, values and adherence to the past. And The New Road of 1914, arguably Munro's finest novel, well able to stand beside Waverley or Rob Roy, has yet again a typical pair in young Aeneas McMaster, son of an Inveraray merchant, and Ninian MacGregor Campbell, the Duke of Argyll's scout, clearly with a kinship with Rob Roy, who journey across Scotland like Balfour and Breck, witnesses to the Highland corruption of Simon Lovett, the treacherous black spider at the heart of Scotland's political duplicity. And what is the New Road? It is General Wade's opening up of the outlaw Highlands, but it is also the future's death knell for the disorderly past, the end of the clan system, of an ancient way of life, arguably the end of the language and culture of Guildham. S.R. Crockett gave up his Free-Kirk ministry in 1895 to write. Crockett at his best is a badly neglected writer of vigorous historical fiction, but his desperate need to make money for his large family, together with extended illness, caused him to move erratically between Scottish and foreign historical fiction, between Kildare and Celtic Twilight, even between light romance and Zola-like realism. But his early novels, like The Men of the Moss Hags of 1895 and his The Grey Man of 1896, which I discover is based fundamentally on Scott's little-known drama Auchendrane or the Ayrshire Tragedy, these are impressive in their stark presentation of Galloway and Ayrshire, divided just as much as Scott's borders in The Lay of the Last Minstrel. Moss Hags replicates the Balfour-Breck realism romance contrast, pairing dour Whig William Gordon with his cousin, the maverick royalist Wat Gordon, outlawed in the time of Claverhouse's persecution. Crockett draws heavily, it must be admitted, on Hogg's The Brownie of Bodsbeck, as well as Old Mortality. That said, at his best, Crockett's sense of the anger, despair, and hatred of Scotland's contending factions is as powerful as anything of Scott or Stevenson. And the Ayrshire novel, The Grey Man, explores the ancient divisions of Ayrshire and Galloway as rival branches of the powerful Kennedys' fight for territorial supremacy in the 17th century. And the tragic story of the Black and the Red Douglases, once more powerful than their Scottish monarchs, fascinated Crockett. The Black Douglas in 1899 and its sequels takes the great families into head-on collision with James II, their quarrel ending twice, you'll remember, in the savage murder of two of the Douglas Earls by James II. And Crockett has his own version of Rob Roy. His trilogy of novels, The Raiders, The Dark of the Moon and Silver Sand, centre on the pairing of three generations of witnesses, of naive young Galloway men set Balfour-like against the elusive gypsy Earl Johnny Fa, King of the Gypsies, also known as the wandering tinkler Silver Sand. Silver Sand and his gypsy clan and their Galloway mountain fastnesses are Crockett's Children of the Mist. This time Scott's tragic opposition of past and present, order and disorder, is reflected in the trilogy's slow inevitability, as Crockett shows, like Scott and Rob Roy in Red Gauntlet, that the day of noble outlaws is past. The final novel in the trilogy ends in the glorious but fatal defiance of modern authority and power by the ancient gypsy clans in their last doomed battle. All Crockett's Scottish historical fiction moves around the clash of establishment authority and outlaw protest, from the Kennedy tragedies of the 1400s the Wars of the Covenant, to the last violent disruption of the anti-clearance movement of the Galloway Levellers in the 18th century, thus yet again fulfilling the terms of Coleridge's assertion of Scott's dominant theme. John Buchan's success at his shockers, his thrillers as he called them, have obscured the fact that he wrote several fine Scottish historical novels, and Buchan continued the tradition begun by Scott, that of radical reassessment of Scottish history and culture. Buchan's Sir Quixote of the Moors appeared in the same year, 1895, as Crockett's Men of the Mossacks, once again in the world of the Covenanters being ruthlessly hunted, this time in the central moors of the lowlands. But with John Burnet of Barnes in 1898, the full inheritance of Scott and Stevenson becomes clear, with decent young John locked in opposition to his evil cousin Gilbert, whom John feels, rather like Robert Ringham with his attendant devil in Hogg's novel, is bound up in some sinister way with my life. And in A Lost Lady of Old Years in 1899, Buchan creates a subtle variation on the dualisms of Scott and Stevenson in his pairing of his young Francis Birkinshaw, the dour and morally uncertain adventurer, with, yet again, Simon Lovett, the charismatic Highland double dealer. Midwinter of 1923 takes Jacobite Alasdair MacLean into England with no less a figure than Dr. Johnson as his friend and Jacobite ally, only to be betrayed by his alter ego and fellow Jacobite, the smooth-arched traitor Nicholas Kidd. But Buchan's undoubted masterpiece is Witchwood in 1927. I recommend this to you if you don't know it. It's a magnificent novel. Here are Scott's themes: religious bigotry, the clash of the ancient royalist loyalty of Montrose with the Whig allegiances of Argyll, which will conclude the novel at the slaughter of Philip Haw in 1645. The new young minister of Woodley, David Semple, is indeed simple in his religious idealism. His vision of the good community is destroyed by the hypocrisy and wiliness of his polar opposite, the church elder Ephraim Caird of Chase Hope. The divisions, dualisms and recurrent tragedies of Scotland are shown at every level in this last and arguably greatest fiction of the Scott tradition. Woodley, the village, is a microcosm of Scotland, is surrounded by the ancient black wood of Caledon, a symbol of the darkness of the superstition and hypocrisy which benight the community. It is the secret place of witches' orgies, the dark side of Calvinism. To David, the Scottish innocent, however, the wood is the place where he meets Catherine Yester, and the name Yester means of the past. Catherine Yester, by far the kindest and worthiest of the village of Woodley, but she dies, and with her symbolic death dies any hope for the bigoted community. David, rejecting his ministry, goes off into an uncertain future as an exiled continental soldier of fortune. There are many other fine novels. Violet Jacobs' Flemington, Naomi Mitchison with the Bull Calves as late as 1947, which is the story of the Haldane family, which ambitiously takes up Scott's theme of a divided family reconciling themselves, Jacobites and Whigs. I reiterate my central argument that this tradition of Scottish historical fiction, apparently preoccupied with setting out the internecine divisions of Scotland, should be seen as a major achievement and movement of Scottish literature. It amounts in the end, I suggest, to a kind of creative stock-taking, a kind of negative positivism, an insistence on probing beneath the surface and shallow Victorian representations of Scotland as presented through Celtic twilight and Kildare simplification. And draw to my conclusion. There is, however, in later Scottish fiction, a final, affirmative and enduring strain inherited directly from Scott. I can only nod here to the richness of Scottish fiction's distinctive treatment of landscape, enduring and magnificent, despite the historical tragedies enacted in these landscapes. And also, I can only nod to the languages of Scotland that these writers use. Highland, Lowland, Borderers. You've only got to think of Scott and Galton, Hogg and Stevenson to realise how vigorously they use traditional language. And these extraordinary, yet very ordinary speakers in an enduring landscape are in the end the final affirmation transcending the passage of historical tragedy. When Scott tried to find a symbol of regeneration, forgiveness for Scotland, he created Jeanie Deans. the real and yet symbolic heart of Midlothian. Midlothian itself a symbol for wider Scotland. That is to say, at grassroots level, Jeannie, the cow feeder's daughter as Geoffrey called her, is presented by Scott as representing what is enduring and essential in Scotland against corruption and division in Scotland and England, as she converts her enemies and finishes the novel in Roseneath, that idiosyncratic halfway house of Highlands and Lowlands. Scott converted Roseneath from a peninsula into an island to become a miniature and symbolic possible Scotland, now regenerated by Jeannie and Minister as an example and microcosm of Scottish reconciliation. For me, the significance of this departure from the usual English model of missing heirs restored, instead being replaced by an assertion of something timeless, transcending history, language, landscape, people, to be found in humble goodness rather than great leaders, reverberates through later Scottish fiction. Galton Hogg shared this democratic thrust. The young men of Stevenson, Monroe, Crockett and Buchan spring from the grassroots of Scotland, like Grasset Gibbon's Chris Guthrie in Sunset Song and Neil Gunn's Finn McHamish in The Silver Darlings. Even the protagonists of contemporary Scottish fiction by writers like Alasdair Gray and James Kelman insist on asserting the human ordinariness of their protagonist. Just as, and I recommend this to you, James Robertson has done with the vast yet utterly recognisable yet ordinary cast of his ambitious Scottish novel of the year, And the Land Lay Still. David Dykes memorably argued that the heroes or significant people in Scots novels are the ordinary Scots, the Mucklebackets, the Dinmots, the Edie Ochiltrees, and of course, Jeannie Deans. History may render our historical fiction as apparently bleak and negative, the accounts of a too often broken nation, but what Scott and his followers show us through their hard fictions is that landscape, our languages, and most of all our people endure and have integrity despite our historical tragedies and divisions. Thank you. I have, of course, the relief of finishing, forgotten to ask the toast. Will you please be upstanding and join me in toasting Scott and his legacy?